Now resume.
Good afternoon, Mr. Commissioner. Ms. Dansra, before the lunch break, we were talking about the division of responsibility for contaminants and fish between DFO and Environment Canada. You advised us that discussions are going on about that between yourself and the Deputy Minister of Environment Canada. I just want to get a little more specific about some of those issues. We heard earlier in these hearings from Sylvain Paradis, former Director General of Ecosystem Science Directorate at DFO, that DFO does not view marine contaminants research and monitoring as its responsibility. And I heard you saying that about monitoring, but being, I may say, slightly more equivocal about the relative responsibilities for research. But I compare that to the evidence of Dr. John Carey, the former Director General of Water Science and Technology Directorate at Environment Canada, who testified that Environment Canada is not monitoring water quality in the marine areas, except as it relates to Canadian shellfish sanitation program. And it was under the impression, that Environment Canada that is, that DFO was responsible for monitoring marine contaminants. So that, would you agree, is a difference of view from what you expressed this morning?
Thank you for the question. If I may, I also would like to correct an error I made on this issue this morning when I spoke about the date that the transfer of the so-called machinery change was made from DFO to Environment Canada, and I said it was in the mid-1990s, but it was actually in the mid-1970s. Yes, and then an MOU was signed in the mid-1980s. My understanding, not having been there, was that there were some pockets of work that remained at DFO, at least this is what I was told, when I started looking into this. And I don't think, it's clear that there are some differences of opinion between staff, some staff in the department. And that's why it's important for us now to be clearing up whatever those differences of opinions are. And when I say the deputy and I are working on this, it's deputies never work alone. We work because people in the department are working together, and so folks inside of both departments are working their way through what the best advice is that they could give me to give to the minister and my counterpart, his minister, on this. So we will work our way through it, and again, it's a question of priorities, and I will take advice from our scientists who will have to tell me the degree of risk that not doing that kind of toxic analysis or toxin analysis would pose for the fishery. And then together inside the department, we would have to determine whether or not we find a different way to get the information, or we decide that it's not risky enough. I can't give you that answer right here, right now, because I would be waiting for advice on that from the people who know.
But you would agree at the moment it appears that there is a gap in that neither DFO nor Environment Canada is doing monitoring of water quality in marine areas.
I don't know. I can't say that specifically, no.
Okay. Let's touch on research then for a moment. And I'm not sure I completely understood your evidence this morning, but I think it was that you aren't sure whether the responsibility for who has the responsibility for research on the effects of contaminants on anadromous fish, whether it's Environment Canada or DFO. Is that correct?
I think what I said was that I'm not sure in all pockets of the country how the division of labor has been established. I'm also not sure in every part of the country whether or not it's been determined that that kind of research is essential. And so I would defer to Laura to give a better answer on how we would make that kind of determination and where I would get the advice on almost an ecosystem approach to when and how we should be doing that kind of research. So I wouldn't say in all cases it's an absolute requirement and our responsibility. In some cases it could be done from a fish health perspective, and that could be yet another body of the government. So fish health for that could have an impact on human health. There are places for that to happen. So I'm not sure. I can't answer the question specifically because we're still working out what the priorities are. But even if it was our responsibility, it would still be based on a priority system based on the risk of not doing it.
Let me ask Dr. Richards, is DFO doing such research? And to be specific, the question is research on the effects of contaminants on anadromous fish.
We are doing limited research, but again, as the deputy has been clear, it is in the context of trying to meet the overall priorities. So there may be some questions, some management questions which are set, which require having knowledge about that to answer some of those questions. We're not doing a broad scale program on contaminants or that issue, but you've already heard some evidence from some of our scientists who are doing some of the contaminant research. But we have a small group, and it has to be in line with the overall priorities and the overall questions are.
And then can you quickly direct us to what overall priorities are determining what research you're doing in this area?
Well, I think there's a few things I can direct you to. First of all, the document that you discussed earlier this morning was a broader a document about how to look at this problem across the country. I think if you look at the numbers in there, you'll see already that in Pacific and the rest of that document, we did not have as big a program in that area traditionally as we did in some of the other regions of the country. So we were dealing with a smaller program. One of the things that we have done in terms of just being more overall efficient with that program was because that kind of program requires some very sophisticated equipment and to do that. So one of the things that we did was decided that we would have 2 major laboratories across the country who would be capable of doing some of those more sophisticated analyses. One of them is the Pacific region. It's based at the Institute of Ocean Sciences, and the other is in Quebec region at the Institut Maurice-Lamontagne. So we do have some capacity to do that, but it's not a huge capacity, and we are doing some work.
Peter Ross, who's the research scientist or a research scientist at the Marine Environmental Quality section of the Institute of Ocean Sciences here in the Pacific region, testified that DFO's lack of a dedicated fish toxicologist was certainly hampering our efforts to understand whether contaminants present a risk to what's happening to sockeye salmon. Do you agree with that?
Well, I mean, he is certainly one of our experts, and we certainly do rely on him and rely on his advice. But we do also need to put it into the broader overall context. We do count on our experts to be in contact with others in the field, to bring in their knowledge, to make us aware of other factors that might come and play into that, and then we'd have to factor all that into the risks and look at the priorities. And I think having done that, we think that probably it's not that there couldn't be some potential there, but it's looked based on some of those analyses and having a discussion with Peter. I think the management response is that it would be more efficient and more practical for us to look at some other avenues.
So are you saying that you're not sure whether research on contaminant effects for Fraser River sockeye is important?
What I'm saying is that we have to look at the overall suite of priorities, or we have to look at, that's only one of very, very many factors. As your reports have demonstrated, there are many different chemicals and many different kinds of things that could be looked at. In fact, there's a tremendous suite of different chemicals that could be examined. And at this point, we don't have any real good information about trying to narrow down that very big question to try to say, well, what would be really important to look at now?
So right now, DFO doesn't have a fish toxicology program in the Pacific region. Is that right?
We have not a fish toxicology per se. We have a laboratory that is capable of doing some analyses. They're used for different programs. One of the things that we're interested in is, for example, using those for tracers for ocean circulation. So there's different uses for some of that information.
But can you tell me what is going on in terms of research on the toxicology involving anadromous fish in the Pacific region? We're in a situation, there are new, lots of interactions with the industrial activities in British Columbia. There's all sorts of things going on.
Mm-hmm.
Can you be more specific about what you're doing, looking at fish toxicology and that relating to Fraser River sockeye?
I'm not aware of any specific programs that we have that are specifically related to Fraser River sockeye. I am aware that we have asked our experts, such as Peter and some of his colleagues, to look at the issue and to provide us with some at least preliminary analysis based on their review and their knowledge that would then fed into some of the discussions that we had at various meetings that were feeding into our advice to you and to the Commission. But that really is what we have done.
So you identify Dr. Ross as somebody. Is there anybody else working in this area? I mean, he says there is no dedicated fish toxicologist in the Pacific region. So who's
we
doing
have
this?
a number of other scientists who are working in that group besides Dr. Ross. I mean, a lot of the things that they are working on are not necessarily fish, but they would be looking at some other aspects of sediments or other factors, not just the fish factor, because really we do have to look at really the broader ecosystem kinds of questions. So we have Dr. Robin McDonald, who's got over 35 years of experience in the department. We have Dr. Sophie Johansson. We have Dr. Michael Economou, and we have a number of chemists who are also working in the lab, and we have Dr. Andrew Ross, who is currently the head of our laboratory of aquatic chemical expertise.
And are they looking into fish toxicology relating to the Fraser River sockeye? Dr. Ross identified this as something that was hampering his ability, or their DFO's ability, to understand whether contaminants pose a risk to Fraser River sockeye. Would you disagree with that?
Well, I think we have looked at we have certainly talked to Peter. We have considered what he has to say, and I am not aware of any specific projects that those individuals are involved in related explicitly to Fraser sockeye.
So
I think that was your question.
It was my question. Would you agree from that background that it does not appear that the effect of contaminants on Fraser River sockeye is a priority for DFO?
Well, I think that what we have tried to do is look at the weight of evidence, and we were thinking that it wasn't the first avenue that we thought was important in terms of the likelihood of finding some impacts. It was not where we would look first. And I think that is consistent with the report from David Marmarick that was discussed earlier this week.
In the 2009 report of the Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development, it was noted that the lack of interdepartmental cooperation between DFO and Environment Canada on Section 36 administration and it recommended that DFO and Environment Canada should clearly establish the expectations for Environment Canada's administration of the pollution prevention provisions, including the expected interactions between the two departments to support delivery of the 1986 Habitat Policy. The DFO and Environment Canada responded by saying the departments accept this recommendation, and by the 31st of March 2011 will review the administration of Section 36 of the Act. So that was made in 2009, that commitment. The deadline has passed. What progress has been made since 2009 in reviewing or clarifying the roles of DFO and Environment Canada when it comes to contaminants research on Andromedas fish on the Pacific region?
There's been significant progress made on clarifying the roles and working on developing a solution. There is not, we don't have the final answer yet, and whether or not it's specific to the work that you just described, I don't think I would go that far, but we are, as I've said earlier, working with Environment Canada at many levels to make sure that we achieve the best possible results. So we are in process right now, and hopefully we'll accomplish, we'll have a better MOU soon. I can't give you an estimate. It's an active project that we have many people engaged in.
I'd like to now touch on another issue which relates to commitments made and with respect to policies, and in particular I would identify the wild salmon policy. Minister Regan wrote a cover message which was in the wild salmon policy saying, "My department is fully committed to the wild salmon policy's implementation." Has DFO been, and is it currently fully committed to implementing the wild salmon policy? Ms. Dansero?
As you know, it is an essential policy for us, and it is definitely a priority policy on the West Coast. It is, you will point to certain dates that have been defined in the document itself, and some of those have been.
I may.
And I will say that not all of those have been achieved, but it is the guiding document for the management of Fraser Sockeye, and continues in that vein, and we will continue to try and achieve the goals as they've been defined.
The Departmental Management Committee is the senior committee in your department?
At the time of the writing of this document, yes, that's what it was called.
What's it called now?
The Departmental Management Board.
Okay, so keeping those two names in mind, when was the last time the wild salmon policy was an agenda item?
I'm not sure this kind of policy would come to the Departmental Management Board unless it was undergoing change of some type. And you may, I think you also know, we have a different governance structure now where we also have a departmental management, or a deputy minister's policy committee, and that policy committee would be the place where changes to this, if there were to be changes to the policy, would be made. It is a regional policy. It's a national policy implemented in the region, and the work on that implementation would be done by the regional management team here in the Pacific region, and they would be the ones who would be looking at this.
My colleague has reminded me that your answer to my previous question, which was to put the quotation from Minister Regan to you, that it wasn't completely answered, and that is the wild salmon, is the DFO currently fully committed to implementing the wild salmon policy?
Yes, absolutely, to the intent of the wild salmon policy. And whether or not we are able to meet some of the deadlines in there, I don't know, because some of them were developed in the absence of science, and we are working at trying to get the answers to be able to set realistic timelines. But yes, in terms of, I think I did answer it when I said it is our guiding document for the management of Fraser Sockeye, and that would not be so if it were a priority.
You have answered it now.
Okay.
You said yes to the question, so thank you. So getting back to the way it has been dealt with in the department and just pursuing this commitment for a moment, I think I heard you say that in my question about when it had last come before the national management committees, by whatever name, in DFO, I think your answer was, well, you didn't answer that, but you said this is a policy, the implementation of which is in the region. Do I take it from that the answer is no, it hasn't come before the national committee, either the management committee or its successor, but that shouldn't be surprising?
That's right.
Okay, but it has not come before.
As far as my recollection is not. David may have a different recollection, but
Well, clearly, the minister of the day and the deputy, et cetera, had discussions on the approval of the wild salmon policy at the time it was approved. I can't recall the exact governance that was used at that time, but there were discussions at the ADM, deputy minister, and minister level to approve the wild salmon policy at the time that it was approved.
and that's correct. I mean, that is where it came, and that it is a policy that was, if it's approved by the minister, then it has to be approved by the deputy and by the senior management structure. But whether or not it has come back since then, I don't think it has.
Yes, and I think that's your recollection as well, Mr. Bevan.
That's correct.
Let me just pursue that a bit. It seems to me it's a national policy, even though it's being implemented in the regions. That means there's no reporting function through to those committees by the Pacific region on how it's coming, and that, as you point out, there are some other deadlines that have been missed here.
It's a living document. It's a document that guides how the Pacific region provides advice to us and to the minister, for the minister to make decisions on a yearly basis for the management of the fishery. So the policy itself doesn't come back under regular review, but the application of the policy is living within all of our management plans.
One of the issues that we've heard, but perhaps the principal one, but certainly a principal issue that's come with respect to the wild salmon policy, is the fact that the implementation doesn't appear to be happening, certainly not in the timeline that it was designed for, and question whether at all. And it's been suggested by a number of the people who spoke on this subject over the course of our hearings that things might happen more quickly if there were a champion in the department pursuing this. And it's a national policy. Why isn't there a national champion keeping on top of this?
The Regional Director General of the Pacific Region is a very senior person in the department. They sit on the management board, and they sit in all of the important national committees. They also report directly to the Deputy Minister, and that means that they are as senior as you can get, apart from the deputy or the associate, and therefore they are significant champions in their own right. There's a senior ADM responsible for the position that David used to hold, senior ADM on the fisheries side, or now ecosystems management side, ecosystem-based management side, and that person would also be very aware and very supportive and very much a champion of the wild salmon policy. So between those two, you have some very serious attention paid to this. Some of the deadlines are not, I don't want to speak on something that I might not be an expert on, but my understanding of some of the deadlines and why they are not met as conservation units or some research is that science builds on science, knowledge builds on knowledge, and we simply don't have sufficient knowledge at this point to have achieved some of the deadlines that we thought we could. But that doesn't mean that the work is not ongoing.
So as I understand your answer, the answer is that the Regional Director General is a part of the national scene and a very senior person in the department, and that's the person to whom you look for the implementation of this policy.
Absolutely.
And that's where you look to find a champion,
Yes.
and that, Ms. Rollinger, would be you. Can you explain why the issues of delays in implementation and the question of commitment and these issues have not been brought forward by the Pacific region to the national committees?
Well, first of all, I would say that in the work planning that we do between the region and national headquarters, that the implementation of the wild salmon policy is very much within the framework of the policy framework for the department, and it is for Pacific salmon, specifically the work that we do for that species, that set of species, under the broad national implementation of the national, what we call the Sustainable Fisheries Framework. So it is certainly discussed in those terms. How will, in terms of the budget that's allocated to Pacific region to do its work generally on fisheries management, budget for science, budget for enforcement, budget for all the various activities that relate to the management and assessment of Pacific salmon. It certainly shows up in terms of the proportion of our funding that is dedicated to Pacific salmon, and has shown up in science priorities in our science work plan over the last 5 or 6 years, and in terms of management decisions, for example, that we have put to the minister in the integrated fishery management plan for each year. It's also part of the habitat program. Now, the question of whether it has gone as fast as originally envisioned is a different question than whether it's been implemented throughout our programs. And I think I have said here before and continue to say that it is implemented throughout our programs, and some of those deadlines continue to be a challenge for us. One of the concerns, I think, is that the implementation, as it was originally envisioned, there's one thing that continually comes to my mind, that we would have limit reference points for all the salmon stocks in BC by 2 years. In fact, we're simply not realistic, and that's been part of the learning of the implementation of the policy. So I would say that the intent of it and the foundation for the decisions that get made in terms of the integrated fishing plans are very much a part of the work we do in salmon, which amounts to in the order of $60 or more million a year in terms of what we put into that. But certainly there are elements of the strategy that is set out that have not been done on deadlines, and I think has something to do with the fact that probably all that information for all those conservation units, by the way, which numbers change from time to time, probably will never be done. But it is our intention to continue to gather that information and to use that information in the management decisions that are envisioned by the wild salmon policy.
Ms. Rollinger, we've, as you pointed out, we've been through a lot of this before, and the purpose of this panel really is to put some of these issues, the overlying issues relating to the wild salmon policy, and the gap between a policy and implementation to those from Ottawa. And so I want to try and keep this to a broad level discussion, but that may not be possible. And things that have happened since you were last here. Let me try this this suggestion. I hear the explanations as to what's happening about the wild salmon policy to be, well, we're really it affects how we do all of our business, whether it's in catch monitoring or whether it's in habitat protection, or all of these decisions are are informed by things we're learning and the point of view from the wild salmon policy. And you know, people have used very high-minded words and important principles to defend it. Describe it as a very forward-thinking, transformative policy. And in a context that's slightly different, there's some words of a witness that I'd like to put to you and just see whether or not you would agree that that's what's happened here. I'm frankly more interested in pinning down what the actions are and finding out whether or not it's really been implemented or whether or not it's just in the background. And the comments here are from Trevor Schwerdtfeger, who was speaking in the context of aquaculture. And he said, "I continue to experience great difficulty with the concept of ecosystem-based approach to management. I think that the idea has tremendous theoretical allure, and I think to build an argument against it is probably difficult. I think that the idea of integrating multiple variables, multiple aspects of the ecosystem, understanding it on a broad-based, multidisciplinary scientific perspective makes an awful lot of sense. Translating that into specific management decisions and actions is much more difficult. Making the transition between the concept of ecosystem-based approaches into direct management action is a challenge." And I hear that conceptually these are giving rise to the way you know, a new appreciation to the way fisheries is looked at. But the question is, how specifically is the wild salmon policy changing decisions in terms of fisheries management? I mean, setting escapement levels, choosing gear types, opening, closings, those sorts of specific things. How is it really working?
In terms of harvest management, there's certainly decisions that have been made every year since the wild salmon policy was announced. And I did mention this before, that part of the wild salmon policy objective was to write down what was in some measure already beginning to happen, and that was the consciousness of stocks of concern and weak stock management in mixed stock fisheries. We have made decisions about harvest rates each and every year on fisheries that specifically have to do with the protection of what we would now call weak stock as we move into the conservation unit definition and the development of the limit reference points. That information is directly taken into account in a very detailed way in the management of, for example, in this case, Fraser sockeye and other sockeye stocks. The management plan includes consideration of the early Stewart sockeye. It reduces sockeye fisheries in order to protect that. It reduces the harvest rate on other abundant stocks in order to protect, for example, Cultus sockeye, which I know you've heard many times. In the Skeena River, we have reduced a harvest rate down to what fundamentally varied between 40 and 60% to now between 20 and 30%. The science activities towards defining the conservation units and developing those limit reference points continue, and we are expecting for the sockeye stocks to have those by the fall of this year, which is along the schedule that we had talked about. In the case of habitat, the implementation of a risk-based approach and identifying the pathways of effects is one of the ways that has taken us towards the wild salmon policy. We have developed a framework for habitat reviews. We have done reviews of admittedly a limited number of conservation units with respect to habitat. I think in all these ways, in terms of how we have allocated science priorities, in terms of management decisions and advice we provide to the minister, we point to the wild salmon policy. We indicate how this information is consistent with the wild salmon policy, and so it's resulted in decisions on harvest. It's resulted in collecting and organizing the information on fish habitat with respect to priority habitat for sockeye, and its set priorities for science. So I think that in many aspects it's been done. I can speak about ecosystem in one way. For example, the environmental information that is incorporated into the day-by-day management of the Fraser sockeye, and I think you heard Barry Rosenberger and others describe the management adjustments. These are made based on water temperature and in-river conditions that are in fact broader ecosystem considerations about salmon migrating up the river. So I think there are a broad suite of ways in which the policy is being implemented. If you look at the strategies set out on page 17 of the policy, are every one of those done? No, they are not. But the effective regulation and the decisions that are made and the science priorities and the work we have done in habitat and integrating ecosystem into decisions all take us in the direction of the intent of the policy. So that's really the only way I could describe how it's being implemented.
Thank you, Ms. Ronger. If we can just sort of bring our record up to date, and I have a couple of questions about this, and perhaps she's best put to Dr. Richards. Could you pull up document 30 from the Commission's list?
Certainly.
Wild salmon policy action step 1.3 requires the monitoring and assessing of the status of conservation units, including a statistically based and cost-effective monitoring plan and monitoring program established by the Department and partners and funded annually. So in terms of assessing CUs, we have heard from Dr. Sue Grant, and a previous version of her paper on this subject is in evidence. I wonder if I could ask you, Dr. Richards, to just identify the document on the screen, which is entitled Evaluation of Uncertainty in Fraser Sockeye, Wild Salmon Policy Status Using Abundance and Trends in Abundance Metrics. And if you scroll to the bottom of that page, Mr. Lund, you'll see that that is the working version, July 5th, 2011. And can you identify that as a newer iteration of this?
There have, Mr. Commissioner, there have been several iterations of this document, of which this is one. It is not the current final iteration.
Yeah, but it follows from the one that's already in evidence.
It follows from
there may have been other
from the original one that was submitted and that was reviewed, previously.
And which is Exhibit 184 in this proceeding. Thank you. Could that be marked, please, Mr. Registrar, as the July 5th draft?
Marked as 1914.
Thank you. And then if I could ask you, Mr. Lund, please, to pull up Commission's document 31, which bears the same title and is dated August 25th, 2011. Is that the most recent version?
This is the most recent current version.
Thank you.
Okay, this is not the final version of the document, but it's close to final.
Could this be marked as the next exhibit, please?
1915.
Thank you. But this is the most recent version.
That's correct.
It's not yet finished.
That's correct.
And what is the timetable for completing this work?
I expect that it will be completed reasonably quickly at this point, certainly this fall. The process now is that this is the final draft that was prepared by the authors. It needs to be approved by the chair of the subcommittee. There needs to be a review to ensure that the authors have addressed the issues that were raised by the reviewers or the issues that the subcommittee requested that they identify and change or update in their document. So this needs to be reviewed to ensure that it meets the requirements, and then it will be And it may involve, in order to do that, some very minor, I would expect at this point no more than sort of minor changes.
Mr. Lund, could you, thank you, Dr. Tracy. Mr. Lund, could you pull up beside or below this document so we can see the title of both Exhibit 184 as well? And we have the two documents, the one on the right being the current version of the draft of Exhibit 184, which is on the left. And we'll see that the title has changed to go from Fraser Sockeye policy evaluate, wild salmon policy evaluation of stock status, state and rate, to evaluation of uncertainty in Fraser Sockeye. Wild salmon policy status using abundance and trends in abundance metrics. I've purposely not tried to pronounce the Latin that's in the title. Can you explain, Dr. Richards, please, why the difference in wording?
The choice of title is really a choice of the authors, and in this case, it's really the authors have chosen to change the title of their paper, but the rationale for that would be to make the title actually more reflective of the content of the paper. It's not, it's the content of the paper has not really changed substantively. There are some differences in the paper in terms of the way the figures were portrayed, but fundamentally the same results are being given in both versions of the paper. So this was really just a change in title. It was not a change in what the paper is really about, or the purpose of the paper.
So the original title was wrong.
Well,
It's
it's
not
not-
an evaluation of stock status. It's
It's
rather an
not,
evaluation of uncertainty.
well, whether a title is wrong or right, I don't think is not, it's, this is science, it's not a right or wrong kind of question. It's really, that's what the authors had chosen initially to call it, and decided that something else was a better descriptor of the content.
And I'm not sure to whom I should put this question, but perhaps you, Ms. Nasrell, that action step 1.3 calls for an evaluation of the status of CUs. If you go to, is there room for a third document up there, Mr. Lund? Shep?
Document, and I'm sure I can look at it and say yes without looking.
So would it be fair to say that the title of the first version of this reflected action step 1.3, but according to the evidence we just heard, not the content, and now neither the content nor the title reflect completion of action step 1.3?
I can't speak to this paper. Nor can I speak to the scientist's choice of a title. That's entirely their purview. I would never question their choices in any way at all, so I can't speak to that.
Dr. Richards?
Yes, thank you. I think, in my view, that this really does address action step 1.3 in terms of the status. This paper does portray, it does provide the benchmarks. It does provide a lot of information on the status of Fraser River sockeye salmon by CU. It isn't definitive about, yes, this stock is in the red zone or the amber zone or the green zone, but it does provide a lot of information that I think our managers can use in terms of how they choose to go forward and manage Fraser sockeye based on that information. It gives them the full range of uncertainty around those different benchmarks. It's done those benchmarks with different models, so they can look at the values or the interpretation, how the interpretation may be impacted by different assumptions that would be in different of the statistical models used for analysis. So it does not give one concrete answer, no, but it does give the full suite of information that I think the managers will want and will be useful to them in doing that. So yes, I think it does address that.
Would you agree that, Ms. Ryan, did you wish to say that?
I think this is one of the challenges, that there is a considerable separation between management and the questions that management asks and the advice that science can provide. And I think what this paper does is tell us what information the scientists can provide. We have, for about 10 or 15 years, and the process of review in science has specifically addressed this, asked for the uncertainty around advice, so that when we're making decisions about and understanding the risks of decisions, we know about the uncertainty. And I suspect that you've learned a lot about this over the last few months. And so when we get this kind of advice, we specifically ask for that, for how sure are you, how good is this information, what has been taken into account, what hasn't been taken into account, and that allows us to develop the advice for decisions about the fishery with an understanding of the uncertainty that we're dealing with.
Dr. Richards, am I correct, though, that this document does not assess the status of CUs?
I think that
Fraser River sockeye CUs.
I think that I would have to say that depends on exactly what you mean by that question, because if you look at some of those tables that are in the figures that are in the document, you can see that it does provide some advice and with some uncertainty about what the status is, which zone each of those CUs is in. That all that information is provided in exhaustive detail in that paper.
So you're satisfied, are you, that when this document is completed, it will allow the determination of upper and lower benchmarks and an assessment of the Fraser River sockeye CUs?
The paper provides a series of benchmarks for looking at upper and lower benchmarks for stock status. So there is information on that available.
No, but will you be able to determine them for each? Does this determine them for each Fraser River sockeye CU?
There is information in this paper. At least there are a few CUs for which there was not really data available, but for the majority of the CUs, there is information that will identify upper and lower benchmarks, that gives the upper and lower benchmarks and classifies, is it red, amber, green, and that information is in this paper. If your question is there more that we could do on this, then I'd say yes. And unfortunately, this is the way that science works. There's always more that we can do on any specific question. So yes, we can continue to do more work on this. We can continue to look at different kinds of models to do these kinds of analyses. So we can go on and go on, but in terms of the immediate question, we have provided that information.
Thank you. Policy action step 3.1 of the wild salmon policy, which is on page 23 of Exhibit 8, requires the department to identify key biological, physical, and chemical indicators of the current and potential state of lake and stream ecosystems. And it says that within 2 years, an ecosystem monitoring and assessment approach will be developed and integrated with ongoing assessment and reporting of the status of wild salmon. More than 2 years obviously has passed since 2005. The evidence we've heard is that there hasn't been any progress on this action step. Can you tell us, Dr. Richards, the current status of 3.1, or perhaps it's Ms. Farlinger?
Well, I think that this really has been difficult to looking at this, but I can say that now there is some work that is ongoing nationally. There are 1 or 2 national review meetings through the CSAS, Canadian Science Advisory Secretariat, that is sponsoring it this year, to look at the issue of indicators particularly for freshwater systems. I think we are interested in trying to do work which is consistent, and so we'd have a consistent national approach. Coming up with appropriate indicators is challenging. There has been a huge body of science around that particular question over the last few years, and it seems like it should be quite simple, but in fact this kind of task has engendered a tremendous amount of scientific debate around the choice of indicators. And so there is work that is ongoing, and we will be having some national peer review meetings yet before spring.
I think it's fair to say that following the report of the Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development in 2009, there was a further commitment to moving towards ecosystem approaches. It's a more general commitment than the wild salmon policy. So what is the time frame within which you expect to meet this wild salmon policy commitment?
Well, I don't think I want to give a specific time frame because these things really are works in progress and ongoing. And as we've heard earlier, if science gives you a time frame, they're going to probably be wrong. So I think I'd like to hedge my bets on this one. Thank you.
We've heard a lot about what it will cost to implement the wild salmon policy, and the fact that the policy itself speaks of being implemented without additional funding. Various numbers have we heard about funding initially of $1 million a year, reducing after that. Mark Saunders made a similar observation in evidence. We heard from a couple of witnesses speaking from outside the department who were very familiar with the policy, Jeffrey Young and Brian Riddle, that $3 million a year or $2.5 million a year for, in Brian Riddle's case, for a short period of time would be enough to get this going. Has there been any assessment within DFO as to what it will cost to implement the wild salmon policy?
Sue can answer on the more specific, but I'm having trouble with the word implement in the context that it's being used here. The wild salmon policy, as I said earlier, guides decision-making to the most senior level inside the department. And even though all of the subparts of the policy haven't reached their full fruition, I guess, that doesn't mean it's not being implemented. We don't have everything done as we said we would in here, but the guiding principles are the guiding principles by which we make decisions. The work that is guiding our science is work that you've seen the scientists are working on, trying to fill in the blanks in terms of knowledge. So, as I also said earlier, science builds on science. When we fill in some knowledge gaps, sometimes we develop new knowledge gaps, sometimes we close them, and it's hard to predict precisely what it will cost to fill all the knowledge gaps and how long it will take to fill all the knowledge gaps. So I worry when I think that there's an expected absolute end point to this document as though it's sitting on a shelf and not being used. It is being implemented.
Let me stop you if I may and just see if I can clarify this, Ms. Dansereau. I certainly wasn't implying that science is finite and comes to a terminal conclusion and that's it. Clearly that's not the case. But the wild salmon policy, as I understand it, has two parts, two basic parts. One is getting the information and putting into place a system for ongoing assessment and monitoring. And the status of the CUs is one thing we talked about. I hadn't actually had any questions, but I'll put one in now about the state of assessment and monitoring of habitat, which is another whole the whole piece of the strategy and the policy. And the evidence is pretty clear that has not been done except with respect to Fraser River sockeye. I was trying not to go over old ground here. So I think it's one thing to say what we learned from the wild salmon policy informs what we do in everything. But I suggest to you that it's a very different thing to say that general thing. That's the sort of comment that I think Mr. Schwarzfeger was speaking of, the difficulty. But here there's some, I suggest, quite specific kinds of information that need to be brought up to date. And I think the evidence is we're almost there on some of it, not on others, but it's not there yet. And then there is the whole question of how you make use of that information to plan for this sockeye salmon fishery in the application here. So saying that it informs is one thing, but actually to me, implementing the wild salmon policy means getting to the state where you're actually using it as a planning device with all of the information you promised to put in place, and then applying the planning techniques. And the planning techniques are also set out there. They include a collaborative approach. They include transparent decision-making and a number of very clear pieces. So simply saying it informs us generally, to me, I suggest, is not implementation. So, and that's what I took the wild salmon policy to be setting out as being the requirement. And please correct me if you have a different impression.
Thank you, and I will not correct you on we all have our own interpretations of these things, but what I meant was, if I look at the principles, which to me a policy should be much more about principles than it should be about specific targets and timelines for implementation, because if I was writing this today, I would separate some of the parts of this out and call those ones policies, and I would call some of the other pieces that are more specific with targets and timelines, I would call those a program, and they would be treated quite differently. So the guiding principles, conservation, honoring obligations to First Nations, open process, sustainable use, those are principles that guide our decision making today. Constrained by some of our transparency requirements, are constrained by ministerial discretion and the right of the minister to make final decisions. But in a very consultative, open, and transparent way. Yes, and we are extremely consultative, and that to some extent we were before this document was written. But we became even more so after this document was written. So I think so the essence of the document is what I think is being implemented, and that's how I mean the decisions are being informed, because they are being informed against these guiding principles and by some of the actions. Now, there are pockets of insufficient knowledge. I completely grant you that, but those knowledge gaps we are working to fill, and I can't give you a dollar amount on what it will take to get to the end point of all of those knowledge gaps, because as I said, sometimes getting one answer creates more questions.
Thank you. Strategy 6 in the wild salmon policy is a 5-year independent review. That was last year. We now have a contractor has been selected and contracted to do the review. Michelle, could you pull up Commission Document 32, please? Now, may I ask Ms. Dansereau or Mr. Bevan, is this this work plan intended to reflect the department's fulfilling of its commitment to action step 6.2, an independent review of the success of WSP in achieving its broad goals and objectives? Oh, thank you.
It certainly is tended to be a significant step in that, in meeting step number 6. Yeah.
And this is the work plan developed for an independent consultant, Gardner Pinfold, right?
That was the consultant who was selected, yes.
May this be marked, please, as the next exhibit.
1916.
Now, am I correct that the evaluation framework for this work plan was developed by DFO?
Yes.
Is that consistent with an independent review, or should the reviewer also have had the opportunity to establish the evaluation framework?
We're certainly in a position to have to inform any person who would do this independent review, what it is we would expect out of it, what the components of it were, and therefore set out the kinds of questions that we would hope to have answered in the review. And yes, we, as I've talked about previously here, we sought advice from the Pacific Fisheries Resource Conservation Council. We sought advice from our internal audit section, and ultimately this is the evaluation strategy was based on all of that and our internal review of what needed to be asked in the policy, or about the policy.
Do you expect this review to tell you whether or not you'll be able to implement it in current budgets?
As I recall the evaluation framework, I don't believe that there were questions about the budget in the evaluation framework.
The wild salmon policy itself describes the review as being directed to the implementation of the policy and suggests that the implementation will be revised to address shortcomings that may be reducing its effectiveness. Is the review limited to that issue of implementation, or is it looking at it more broadly?
I would say in general that the evaluation framework talks about the objectives that the policy set out and the implementation and is as described in that section that you just read. Yeah. So I wouldn't say it asks questions such as, is this the right policy? It asks questions about implementation of the policy.
But when will that, we asked for that, for drafts of that and for the final, which is supposed to be due next week, is that correct?
My understanding is in early October we're supposed to see the report, yes.
And it will be available publicly and to the commission
Yes.
in early October.
Well, it'll be available to the commission. We probably wouldn't publish it publicly until we've gone through it with the reviewer and finalized the report.
Will you make it available to the commission and participants?
Yes.
When you have it?
Yes.
So in early October.
That's my
Our hearings will be over by then, so I'm not.
That's my understanding of when we expect to get the report, yes.
Thank you.
We're going to now recess for 15 minutes.